bookworms. Today I am doing a really fun video. I am going to be picking out my top 20 books from the last 10 years. So this was actually a Top 10 Tuesday topic. Top 10 Tuesday is a weekly meme that a lot of bloggers do. I never remember to look at the topics ahead of time, but this one recently came up and I thought it was such a good idea and I really wanted to do it for myself. It's supposed to be the top 10 books of the past 10 years, but I decided to do the top 20 and pick one contemporary and one fantasy book for each year. And the way that this works is that each of the titles that I'm picking per year are published in that year. So typically, when I do end of the year videos, I'm like, these are the top 10 books I read this year, but they weren't necessarily published this year. This video is, these are the top 20 books and they were published in these years, but I didn't necessarily read them in those years. So something a little bit different. I hope that that made sense. I don't know if I explained that very well, so I apologize. This weekly meme is hosted by the Artsy Reader Girl. It was created by Jamie from the Perpetual Page Turner. It used to be hosted on her blog, but now the Artsy Reader Girl has taken it over. So anyway, I'm going to be working backwards. I'm going to be starting with 2019. I'm going to just be using 2019 releases that I've read so far this year. For fantasy, I have to say that my favorite has been The Wicked King. Obviously, I don't think that's any surprise to anyone who's been watching my channel for any amount of time. And then as far as contemporary goes, I'm a little bit torn. I feel like I've read some really great releases this year, but I probably have to go with Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I just really love this book so much, and I feel like I've raved about it a lot in videos recently, so yeah. So good. Also, you guys have no idea how hard it was to narrow down to just 2 books per year. Now for 2018, I'm sure it is once again no surprise, but for fantasy, my favorite book of the year was definitely The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I've already read this more than once and I love it so much. I'm rereading it again this year before The Queen of Nothing comes out. I just love this series. It's like my favorite young adult fantasy series and it's the best. And for a contemporary, my favorite book published in 2018 was An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This one is contemporary and you'll find it in the contemporary section at the bookstore, but there is definitely a major sci-fi element to it, though it does read more like a contemporary. This one was so good. I can't wait to read whatever Hank writes next. In 2017, my favorite fantasy book was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I inhaled this book on my 9.5-hour flight from Alaska back to New York, and I read the whole thing just on that flight. It was a red-eye flight. I stayed awake for the entire thing. I watched the sunset in Seattle while I was reading, and then I watched the sunrise in New York while I was still reading, and it was just such a strange experience, but I loved this book so much. I was so captivated by it. I love Laszlo. He's a fascinating character, and I just thought this was such a beautifully done fantasy series. I also love the conclusion, Muse of Nightmares, and yeah, this was for sure my favorite fantasy of 2017. And my favorite contemporary of 2017 was Always and Forever, Lara Jean by Jenny Han. This is the conclusion to the To All the Boys series. There was originally only 2 books. It was a duology, but Jenny decided that she still had more that she wanted to tell, more story left to tell for these characters. And I'm just so thankful that she did, because Lara Jean came so far in this book, and just seeing her character arc from the first book until this book, there's such a huge amount of maturity and just growth that Lara Jean really undergoes, and it was so great. It's no secret that I love this series, but this 3rd book was actually my favorite book in the series. My favorite fantasy book in 2016 is A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. This was definitely my favorite book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I'm pretty sure everyone is already well aware of what this book is about, but I really loved it. I thought that this was just such a great installment, and sadly I didn't like the end of the series as much as I liked the 2nd book, but this one I will forever treasure. And my favorite contemporary published in 2016 was definitely The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Hyun. This is another one that I didn't read during during the year that it was published. I definitely read it a little bit later, but I just loved it so much. It takes place in New York City over the course of one day, and it follows a girl who finds out that her family is getting deported and her whole life is kind of being derailed, and she meets this guy and the two of them have this really cute like one-day romance, and the whole book was just very realistic, very well done. I loved this story so much, loved these characters, and I was just captivated from the first line because it was a line from the Cosmos series, which was hosted by Carl Sagan, and yeah, it was amazing. My favorite fantasy published in 2015 is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is one that I just completely fell head over heels in love with when I was reading. I thought it was such like a beautifully done fairy tale, and it totally drew me in. I was so invested in Agnieszka's story, how she got chosen as the girl who would be sacrificed to go and live with the dragon, who is not a dragon but is a wizard within this town in order to protect them, and there's like this threat happening that's coming from the woods, and there's a lot of magic, and it was just gorgeous. And my favorite contemporary that was published in 2015 is one that I literally just read in June, and that is The Start of Me and You by Emory Lord. I can't believe that I waited so long to read this book. I loved it to pieces. Follows a girl named Paige, and she is trying to get over the death of her boyfriend, and then she challenges herself to do a couple of things to try to get her outside of her comfort zone and get her like to try to start living normally again. And then she meets this guy Max, who's amazing, and the friend group in here is just so great, and I just loved it to pieces, and I'm so excited that Emory wrote a sequel to it. I actually got a copy of it at Book Expo, and I'm planning on reading it in July. My favorite fantasy of 2014 was Blue Lily, Lily Blue by Maggie Stiefvater. I love the Raven Boys series, and Blue Lily, Lily Blue is actually my favorite book within the Raven Boys series. So this was just like no contest for me. I felt like the first two books, like while I love the Raven Boys and while I love the Dream Thieves, those books were a lot of laying of groundwork and a lot of buildup. And Blue Lily, Lily Blue is really where we got the action and the payoff, and it was amazing. And then my favorite contemporary is To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han, which I mentioned the third book, Always and Forever Lara Jean, which was my favorite of 2017. So this is actually the first book in the series. This book really just like spoke to me on so many levels. I felt like Lara Jean was such a relatable character. I loved how important family was to her and how much of an introvert she was, and how she really liked to just like stay home and bake and like watch TV with her sister, because that is totally exactly what I love to do. So I really liked getting to see her romance. It was the cutest thing in the entire world. It was just such a fun book. I love everything about it still. My favorite fantasy of 2013 is Clockwork Princess by Cassandra Clare. This is the conclusion to the Infernal Devices series. The Infernal Devices is still my favorite series that Cassandra Clare has ever written, and I just felt like this was the most perfect conclusion that I've ever read, like ever. And it's the only series where I feel like I was so invested in both love interests, and it could not have been wrapped up more perfectly. And my favorite contemporary is obviously Fangirl, no question, by Rainbow Rowell. I love this book so much. I felt like Kath was such a relatable character. I just remember like reading this and feeling like, wow, like Rainbow Rowell just gets me. Kath dealing with her anxiety and Kath being so into fandom. It was the first time that I felt like I really saw a lot of myself reflected in a character, and that meant so much to me, and I have a million copies of this, and I love this book forever. Then we're up to 2012. So my favorite fantasy of 2012 was The Diviners by Libba Bray. I was totally captivated by the story. It takes place in New York City in the 1920s, so the setting was just amazing, and I love that it had all of the paranormal stuff going on, and it was really just such an entertaining mystery, and that had that like thriller aspect to it. I remember being so scared while I read this. I read it so quick I couldn't put it down, and I just love the series so much, and I'm so glad that we finally have a release date for the final book, because now I will read the third book. And I have to say, I did not read very many contemporary books in 2012, or that have been published in 2012. I don't know if there was like not that many that came out that year, or if it was me personally that I just wasn't reading them at the time. So for Best Contemporary, I chose The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. I really enjoyed this book. It's definitely not one of my favorite contemporaries that I've ever read, but it's definitely one of the only contemporaries that I loved that was published in 2012, so that's why it's the answer for this question. In 2011, my favorite fantasy was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This book I remember because I read it in one sitting on Christmas, and that has always just stuck with me because Christmas is like one of my favorite days of the year, so that is a magical time, and then to have this magical atmospheric story that just kept me so like happy. It was such a great Christmas. I love this book so much. I have a couple of different editions of it, this one definitely being my favorite one. It also has like the black sprayed pages, but this book has meant so much to me, and that's also why I'm so excited that The Starless Sea is finally coming out this year. And for favorite contemporary, again, I don't feel like I read a ton of contemporaries that were published in 2011, but I decided to go with Lola and the Boy Next Door by Stephanie Perkins. I could have gone with another Jenny Han book, which would have been the conclusion to the summer series, but I do think that I liked Lola and the Boy Next Door better overall. This was by no means my favorite in the Anna Companion series, but it again was my favorite contemporary published in 2011. In 2010, my favorite fantasy was Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. This is the beginning to the trilogy that I had already mentioned before, but I just loved being in the London Institute. I love the historical setting. I really love Will, Tessa, and Jem. They are continually some of my favorite characters within the Shadowhunter world. After the million years that Cassie Clare has been writing all these Shadowhunter books, they still are just like standouts to me, and I love them so much. And then for favorite contemporary, I would say Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins. I really love the idea of going to Paris. When I was in college, I went to fashion school, and I've always been like obsessed with the idea of going and visiting Paris, but I've never had the pleasure of actually traveling there. So I was definitely living vicariously through Anna in this book. I know that a lot of people have issues with it. Nowadays, I honestly haven't read it in quite a while. I kind of do want to do a reread of it, but I remember that I loved it so much when I read it, so this was for sure my favorite contemporary that year. And then finally, in 2009, I feel like 2009, I hadn't really been like totally actively using Goodreads at that point, so I'm definitely missing books that I read during that year that could have been something that I might have enjoyed more, but the things that I could find on Goodreads that I read that were published that year. For fantasy, I decided to go with The Magicians by Lev Grossman. This is again a weird choice because this was definitely not one of my favorite books that I read. It took me quite a while to actually read this full thing. I tried to read it like 2 times before I finally finished the book, but it did get progressively better as I was reading, and I feel like each book in the series gets progressively better as you read, and it as a complete story, it's a great series, but as this one book, it just wasn't like my favorite fantasy, but it's my favorite fantasy published in 2009. And as for a contemporary, If I Stay by Gail Forman, this book made me cry so much, and I just thought it was such an interesting concept, and I still haven't watched the movie actually, now that I'm thinking about it, which I need to do. This book just really like pulled at my emotions and really made me cry, which I didn't really tend to cry very much when I read books when I was younger. Now I cry all the time. But for something to have moved me so much emotionally, like it really did leave a big impact on me, and I still really love this book very much. I didn't really like the second one, but I do love this first book, and it will forever hold a special place in my heart. So those are my top 20 books from the last 10 years. Let me know your answers. I find this question to be so interesting, and there were some years that I had such a hard time picking just one title for fantasy or one title for contemporary, and then some other years where it was like, well, this is obviously the fantasy, but there are like 10 contemporaries that I would want to pick. For instance, Queen of Shadows, I forget what year that was published, but that was definitely a top contender, but it just didn't compare to whatever I did choose for that one. It was really tough, and it was interesting to go back and re-examine some of the books that I have read by their published date, because that's not usually how I think of them. I usually just go by whatever I read this year. Let me know some of your answers, and that's all that I have for this video, so I will see you guys soon in a new one. Bye!